Today, we're going to dive into one of the most significant economic downturns in all of modern history, the Great Depression. It is an absolutely incredible story of unbelievable highs, terrifying lows, and, lessons that still echo today.
I mean, that one sentence just says it all, right? It perfectly captures the sheer shock that millions of people felt. This wasn't some slow, gradual decline, no. It was a sudden, terrifying freefall that changed everything forever. So, how on earth did it happen? Okay, so to really get the crash, you've got to understand the party that came right before it. After World War I, America jumped headfirst into the Roaring Twenties. It was this incredible decade of prosperity, huge cultural shifts, and just wild, unchecked optimism.
I mean, this decade was just electric. Factories were pumping out amazing new gadgets like cars and radios that people couldn't get enough of. The stock market was going through the roof, and for so many people, it really felt like the good times were never, ever going to end. Get this, the total wealth of the U.S. literally doubled in just 7 years. And this booming stock market, it became a national obsession. A huge reason for that was this thing called buying on margin. It basically let anyone, and I mean anyone, from cooks to taxi drivers, gamble their life savings in the market. You could buy $100 of stock with just $10 down. Can you imagine? This was a party built entirely on borrowed money, and it was all fueled by this crazy belief that stocks could only go up.
But here's the thing. While this massive party was raging on Wall Street, the real economy was starting to show some serious signs of trouble. Factories were actually making more stuff than people could buy, farmers were really struggling, and personal debt was at an all-time high. But in the middle of all the excitement, these warning signs were pretty much completely ignored.
And then, just like that, the music stopped. All of that blind optimism that had fueled the entire decade was about to smash head-on into a brutal, brutal reality.
October 24th, 1929. They call it Black Thursday. The market suddenly just fell off a cliff as a massive storm of sell orders hit Wall Street. A record 12.9 million shares were traded as investors, totally panicked, rushed for the exits. The Dow dropped 11% right at the opening bell.
You'd think that would be the worst of it, right? Nope. The panic just got worse. The very next Tuesday, now known as Black Tuesday, the floodgates just blew wide open. The market plummeted another 12%. This wasn't a dip, you guys. This was a complete and total collapse.
In just a matter of weeks, the equivalent of over $200 billion in today's money, it just vanished. Paper fortunes, life savings, the dreams of an entire generation, all of it wiped out in an instant.
And this was the trigger. Remember all that money people borrowed to buy stocks? Well, this was the moment of truth. They started getting something called margin calls. The brokers were demanding their money back, and they wanted it immediately. To pay them, people were forced to sell their stocks for pennies on the dollar, which just made the crash even worse and completely sealed their financial ruin.
A stock market crash is bad enough. But what happened next? That's what turned this into a catastrophic chain reaction that dragged the entire country, and honestly, the whole world, into a decade of pure despair. It was like a line of dominoes, just one thing knocking over the next. The crash triggered this brutal domino effect. As investors went bankrupt, they couldn't pay back their loans, so the banks started to fail. With no banks to give them credit, businesses had no choice but to shut their doors, firing their workers by the millions.
The numbers here are just staggering. In 1929, unemployment was at a really healthy 3%, but by 1933, 1 out of every 4 working Americans was jobless. Think about that. 1 in 4. An entire generation was just left with no work and absolutely no hope.
And this wasn't just about numbers on a chart. This was a human catastrophe. Bread lines stretched for blocks in cities. People were literally starving. This quote, it just captures the physical pain of a nation that was brought to its knees.
And you could see the signs of despair everywhere you looked. Homeless families built these little shacks out of scrap metal, and they called them Hoovervilles. At the exact same time, out in the heartland, a horrific drought turned millions of acres of good farmland into a barren wasteland, the Dust Bowl, forcing a desperate migration out west.
But, out of all this devastation, America started looking for a change, for a new direction. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 marked this fundamental shift away from despair and toward action.
With these powerful words, FDR tried to break the psychological grip that the Depression had on everyone. He promised the American people a New Deal, a really bold series of government programs designed to fight this crisis head-on.
So, the New Deal was just this flurry of government action. The idea was pretty simple. Tackle the problems directly. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, put millions of young men to work. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, was created to protect people's savings in banks. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was set up to police the stock market. This was a radical, massive expansion of the government's role in the American economy.
Now, it's super important to remember, this wasn't just an American problem. The Great Depression was a global crisis, and the whole world was hurting. But the responses were very different. While democracies like the US turned to social programs, the economic despair in countries like Germany and Italy created the perfect breeding ground for fascism, putting them on a dark path to rearmament and eventually to another world war.
So the Great Depression left these deep, deep scars, but its legacy also fundamentally reshaped the United States and our whole relationship with the economy.
When you boil it all down, the legacy is immense. It led to the creation of a social safety net with programs like Social Security. It established the financial guardrails of the FDIC and the SEC that, still protect us today. And it served as a brutal, painful lesson about the dangers of unchecked speculation. Now, while the New Deal absolutely offered relief and, maybe more importantly, hope, it wasn't a magic bullet. The economy kind of limped through the 1930s, and here's the really tragic irony. What truly ended the Great Depression was the massive industrial production required to fight World War II. It took one global tragedy to end another.
And that, of course, brings us to today. The world has changed a lot, but the basic forces of fear and greed and speculation, well, they are far from dead. And that leaves us with a final and pretty crucial question.